interest to us. It's one that we ought really to focus upon. That scene is of Italy in the years between 1919 and 1921. The suffering Italy, an Italy near decomposition, an Italy turbulent, an Italy really that is on the verge of revolution. And that Italy, after all, was one in which the ordinary forms of government, in which that ministerial and parliamentary government that had been traditional no longer either represented Italian society or had the slightest program for resolving the contradictions of Italian society. It was an Italy in which the economy, as a result of the war, had been shattered, and in the shattering of that economy had destroyed whatever security the petty bourgeoisie had and had driven the working class really against the wall. And yet an Italy in which that working class in the years 1919 to 21 was immensely courageous, was immensely inventive, that not only went on strike but did more than that, did things that West European workers had never done until that time, occupied factories, organized factory councils, really began to make the enterprise of industry their own. All of that in an Italy between 1919 and 21. And we say then that Italy had entered a revolutionary situation. Italy had entered that period which, as Gramsci said, was Italy under Kerensky, before that real revolution should take place. And consequently, we really have to pose that question, and that central one: why, if Italy had reached that stage of a revolutionary situation, was a socialist party which declared itself revolutionary and dedicated to the dictatorship of the proletariat, why that Italian Socialist Party failed to lead a revolution in 1919, 20, and 21, and why then the fruit of those aspirations of the working class fell so bitterly to the fascists. That is the question then that we pose, and we must zero in more closely on the conditions of Italy in those years. And we say in the first place that the war had a catastrophic effect upon that society and that country. That Italy had gone almost frivolously into war in 1915. You know that Italian historians talk about Maggio Radiosa, that radiant May of 1915, when suddenly the nation supported this effort for war. And yet in 1915, Italy in a way was forced into war by the propaganda of very self-interested groups. Those nationalist groups that represented, after all, big industry, that cartelized industry of Italy, that wanted colonies, that wanted markets, and that wanted very fundamentally a disciplined working class inside the country, which discipline should be imposed by the very conditions of war. And beyond that, those left interventionists, and those left interventionists who create such a tradition of strength that ultimately will be the soil out of which fascism will grow. Because those left interventionists, the people like the anarcho-syndicalists, like the futurists, like those left-wing nationalists, talked about the fact that the war would be the rejuvenation of Italy, that the war would be the basis not only for launching a European revolution, but launching a revolution inside Italy. It is Marinetti, after all, saying, guerra igiene del mondo, war is the hygiene of the world. It is the way in which we cleanse ourselves internally, and you see what that is about. It is an attempt to take the conceptions of nationalism and socialism and wed them together. And yet those very conceptions, when wedded together, create a tremendous mystification, a tremendous kind of blow to consciousness. Because nationalism involves, after all, a collaboration of classes, and socialism involves the struggle of one sector of society against another. And to talk about a national socialism presupposes that a victorious Italy will then find a collaboration of classes willing to make a renaissance, a renovation of all of Italian society. And it is on this kind of promise, after all, that so many left-wingers, intellectuals, students, and so forth supported this intervention into the war. A war for which Italy was not prepared economically or militarily. And consequently, the consequences proved to be a disaster. A disaster at the human level, first of all. That Italy lost in the First World War enough to stagger the imagination. Was 600,000 dead in that 3-year war for Italy? Was 600,000 mutilated and permanently mutilated? Over 1.5 million wounded in the war, a terrible human suffering. And beyond that, a shattered economy. The kind of economy that was very fragile during the war and supported only by outside credits, by the credits of the United States and Great Britain. And when those credits were cut off, as they were in March of 1919, the Italian currency, the lira, began to be depreciated vastly, so that you get a tremendous inflation, the kind of rise in the cost of living that really is impossible for people to cope with. If you take the year 1913 as the index number of 100 for cost of living in Italy, by 1920 that index number reaches 624, which means that the cost of living increased more than sixfold in that period, and especially in the years immediately after the war. It means that some people were able to profiteer. Quite obviously, the monopoly trusts gained a great deal from the war and the immediate post-war. If you talk about those great steel trusts, like Ilva, for example, the automobile trust of Agnelli, like Fiat, or that great trust of Ansaldo, which was such a conglomerate, you're talking about enterprises that gained an immense amount, that managed really to concentrate their enterprises and to discipline their workers during the war, and who profited immensely. But if you apply that inflation and that rise in the cost of living to the way in which people who lived on fixed incomes had to survive, you begin to see the kind of battering that an Italian society took in those years immediately after the war. And it had a twofold effect. It had the effect, for example, on the part of the petty bourgeoisie of a feeling of complete and total insecurity. And consequently, you get little enterprises, shopkeepers, all kinds of small producers, really beginning to feel as though they will be defunct, as though they will lose everything that they have had. It's the period 1919 when you begin to get this petty bourgeoisie organizing itself, concentrating itself in order to try to resist the force of monopoly and the force of concentration in Italian society. It's the period when the so-called populist party is founded, which is extremely important and extremely interesting in terms of the mood of Italian society. The Partito Popolare, or the Populist Party, was a Christian democratic party, a Catholic democratic party founded by a priest on Sturzo, and it was founded in order to corral the peasants into a party in which presumably they could fight against the weight of monopoly, the weight of those industrial monopolies that made their cost of living so very high. But like Christian democracy always, and Catholic parties of that sort, it was a double-edged sword, because it was fighting against monopoly in order to save the peasantry from socialism. In other words, it was set up as that kind of a barrier. But it is symbolic of the kind of fears and insecurities that really are fraught in Italian society and shot through it at that level of the middling classes. And so far as the working class is concerned, it is in total disarray, in total strife and opposition to this kind of inflation. You enter in 1919 a period really of strike action that is continuous and seems never to do anything but crest until the middle of 1920. All of which means that both at the human level and the economic level, you have a society in chaos. The compensation for which was supposed to be the victory in the war. And the victory in the war, after all, was not forthcoming, neither in terms of colonies nor in terms of gratification. And you have to begin to put yourself in the position of these Italians who ultimately did fight a war and came out presumably on the winning side. And all of those troops who were near danger in that period of time, all of those officers who thought in terms of a post-war period in which there would be places for them, in which there would be jobs, in which there would be gratifications, all of that kind of aspiration, that millennium that was supposed to begin with the peace, all of it, you see, shattered. All of it shattered even at the level of acquisition, even at the level of imperialism. because Italy proved to be not a gainer or a winner imperialistically in the First World War. When the Paris Peace Conference was held in 1919, the Italian case was put, and it was the case that was based upon the Treaty of London of 1915, and that was that the Italians were supposed to get out of their intervention certain kinds of territory. They were supposed to get colonies in North Africa from the Germans and from the Italians, from the British and from the French. They were supposed to get the Somaliland. They were supposed to get protectorates in the old Turkish Empire in the Middle East, but especially they were to get Italia Irredenta. They were to get, after all, those contiguous territories with Austria. They were to get Istria and Carniola, the cities of Trieste and Fiume, with their Italian populations, and the whole Dalmatian coast. In other words, they were to become a bigger and a greater and a stronger Italy. No, none of that happened. And Wilson went, after all, to Paris in 1919 as the protector of small nations. And Yugoslavia, being organized and formed at that time, was a small nation. And Wilson said, you cannot take those territories of the Adriatic away from Yugoslavia. And in addition to which, if we do, maybe Yugoslavia will fall into the hands of the Bolsheviks. And consequently, the Italians went away from Paris and demanded, all of which gave rise to the myth of the mutilated victory. The myth of the mutilated victory, which plays the same role in Italian history that the myth of the stab in the back plays in German history. In German history, that myth of the stab in the back meant that they were the socialists who betrayed the war effort and consequently made peace. In other words, they insisted that Germany did not lose militarily. And the myth in Italy runs something like this, that Italy really was a victor, but at the peace conference, it proved that a proletarian nation, as the left interventionists called Italy, that a proletarian nation could never really triumph over the big, sated, capitalistic nations, and consequently, Italy was deprived of the fruits of her victory. It meant ultimately that she would have to avenge herself. You see what this means, this myth of the mutilated victory? It means ultimately that the focus of attention in Italian society is deflected, just as it was deflected by the myth of the stab in the back, just as it was deflected in America by the myth of 20 years of treason in the State Department. The idea is that you do not look internally into your society to find out where the roots and the sources of malevolence are, but you look outside and you decide that you have been deprived or you have been betrayed in some manner or another. And consequently, what this myth of the mutilated victory did was to get the big industrial cartels off the hook. They were the ones that pushed Italy into the war, and to feed into the propaganda of fascism. Because they were the fascists, after all, in 1919. The Fasci of Rome, for example, in May of that year, who pronounced their condemnation of what they called the plutocratic conspiracy against our proletarian nation. Foreign banking imperialism, which has deprived us of our victory, all of which means, you see, that you have really a force of mystification developing in Italian society. And out of that, a certain kind of fascism will grow, a fascist organization that will feed upon this notion of a mutilated victory and the necessity to avenge it. And fascism organizes organically in 1919 in Italy. Groups of fascists are formed finally in March, on the 23rd of March of 1919. And the cadre or the context for that is terribly important. Because Mussolini, in calling his meeting of the 23rd of March in Milan in 1919 to organize the first fasci, the first groups of fascists, in calling that meeting, he was inspired by what revolutionary syndicalists, or one-time revolutionary syndicalists, had done in 1918. He was inspired by Alceste de Ambris, and he was inspired by Edmundo Rossandi. And both of those were to become important members, ultimately, of the fascist hierarchy. And what they were, you see, were syndicalists who had broken with the traditional revolutionary syndicalism right at the point of the war in September of 1914. They had broken from their syndicalist organization and formed an interventionist organization. They had formed something called the Unione Italiana del Lavoro, and that Italian Union of Labor, an interventionist syndicalist group headed by D'Andres and Rossoni, with the notion of corporatism in its ideology. In other words, with the notion that the way ultimately that Italy will be able to resolve its tremendous inner contradictions is by establishing a kind of collaboration of classes, a kind of corporation in which all classes in Italy will work for the renewal, will work for the Renaissance. And D'Andres, in March of 1918, right before the end of the war, founded a magazine called Renewal, which magazine projected this point of view. In May of 1918, D'Andres and Rossoni founded the Unione Socialista Italiana, the Italian Socialist Union, toward a corporate society, all of it left-wing, all of it presumably to resolve the great social crisis of Italy, all of it the idea that a victorious Italy would have that renovation. And it's out of that kind of soil that Mussolini began to operate. Now, Mussolini was demagogue and opportunist, and tremendously ambitious. And when he wrote in 1918 and 1919 in Popolo d'Italia, he wrote ultimately to all classes. There is a contradiction, there is a kind of opportunism that really is apparent, that really is evident in Mussolini. He supports, for example, the strikes of the postal workers and the railroad workers in January of 1919. Writes stirring articles in favor of their right to strike, even though they are state employees. Then supports the claims of the veterans coming back from the wars who find Italy such a desolate place for them. And then also supports the claims of the industrialists. When the industrialists meet at Bergamo, for example, in January of 1919, and demand that the state remove all of the restrictions upon enterprise which it had imposed in the war, Mussolini applauds them. And when the ship owners of Genoa meet in March of 1919 and declare that the holiest crusade is the crusade against Bolshevism, Mussolini applauds them. He applauds all. He appeals to all. And the common denominator is the nation. And the common denominator always is the strong and vengeful nation. And it is that kind of mystification, you see, that you have to cope with in Italy in those post-war years. And it's with that kind of a thrust that Mussolini calls a meeting in the Piazza San Sopotro on the 23rd of March of 1919 to found the first fascist organization. And when that first fascist organization is founded in March of 1919, there are 119 delegates. And those delegates are mainly of the left. They are futurists, they are syndicalists, they are veterans. There are no great industrialists there, no military people. They are people who are the left interventionists. And they formed the so-called Fasci di Combattimenti. And they found them the first of those fascist paramilitary organizations. Organizations for propaganda, organizations for street action, all of it dedicated to the greatness of the nation, because it is instructive that these fasci, when they were first founded, adopted no program. There is no program until June of 1919. The closest explanation you get of what the fasci were supposed to do is in the article of Mussolini in Popolo d'Italia, the very next day, the 24th of March. And this is what he writes: We permit ourselves the luxury of being aristocrats and democrats, conservatives and progressives, reactionaries and revolutionaries, legalists or illegalists, depending on the circumstances of time, place, and milieu. opportunistic, all men to all things, and you come a little bit closer to the reality with Ferruccio Vecchi, who is the head of the Arditi. And the Arditi are those paramilitary organizations that already are roaming the streets like a pride corps in Italy, and who joins with Mussolini and the fascists. And Ferruccio Vecchi puts it this way: we swear to defend Italy, we are ready to die for it, we are nationalists, that nationalism will become the red thread of fascism. But you come even closer to the reality when you read the conservative nationalist press, because Idea Nacional, which was the press of the right wing, the press of the great industrial cartels, commented also on the founding of these fasci on the 24th of March and said this: we now have a counterpoise, hopefully a powerful one, against the coming attack of Bolshevism. We have a counterpoise and we welcome it. And consequently, with fascism, it was not only a question of appealing to all classes, but effectively of being anti-socialist. Anti-socialist in a time, after all, when socialism was the great threat, when socialism was the great potentiality. Is there a need for evidence of that? The 15th of April of 1919, less than a month after the fasci are founded, comes the first great fascist action in Italy. And that fascist action takes place in Milano, in the great center, after all, of socialism. And in Milano there is a strike on the 15th of April. A general strike of the working class population to avenge or to protest the killing of a worker 2 days earlier in a demonstration. And in that strike, the fasci participate. And Mussolini and Marinetti rouse now some 300 of the Arditi of this paramilitary organization and charge an unarmed crowd. And the police look on willingly, and people are clubbed and beaten, and then the cry goes up to the office of Avanti, to the office of the Socialist Party newspaper. The fascists burst into that office of Avanti, break up the press and the internal fixings of the office, destroy it, and set it ablaze. And they are congratulated. And it is, after all, a general of some note who writes the next day of that action, and this General Caviglia, the Minister of War: your battle in the Via Mercanti yesterday was decisive. Socialism will not triumph. And already there is collaboration from military people inside the government with this action that the fascists take. And there is a nationalist current. And it is that current on which Mussolini and the fascists really feed. And it is a current that really can be contained, and this is the point, in the years 1919 and 20, but is always there as a force. And it centers in 1919 around Fiume. And Fiume becomes an issue, and a powerful one, in these post-war Italian politics. Because Fiume is a city with an Italian majority. And it is on the Adriatic coast, and Italy wanted it. And comes the 16th of May of 1919, and Fiume is given over as a trusteeship to the League of Nations. And the Italians are frustrated. And there is all kinds of nationalist demand of Fiume or death. And the Italians inside that city of Fiume begin to clash with the occupying League of Nations armies. And finally, in September of 1919, comes one of the episodes out of which fascism really ultimately triumphs, comes the occupation of Fiume by a totally illegal force, a force of legionnaires, of volunteers, headed by the poet Gabriele D'Annunzio. And D'Annunzio occupies Fiume on the 12th of September of 1919, declares himself the president of Fiume, makes a plebiscite, has annexation to Italy. The Italian government doesn't recognize it, and suddenly you have a poet as a literal fascist dictator in the city of Fiume. And he wears a uniform, and the legionnaires do, and D'Annunzio is a poet, and he makes hymns, and he decides on a salute, and he decides on a chant, And all of those become the trappings of fascism. Mussolini goes to Fiume and talks to D'Annunzio, and D'Annunzio says we must have a march on Rome, and Mussolini discourages him. He wants a march on Rome, but not D'Annunzio. And consequently, it is precisely that kind of nationalism which becomes the danger. And yet, all of that is hindsight. If you look at 1919 square away and in the face, it is a revolutionary Italy. And it is a socialist and a communist Italy for sure, if you look at it within that context. 1919 is a year of phenomenal strikes. The month of May, there were 316 strikes. In the month of June, strikes almost every day, including a general strike of school teachers, a general strike in the city of Naples, all of those strikes about local economic issues, but becoming more and more politicized. Strikes that begin, after all, to have mot d'ordre and slogans about the Soviet Union, opposition to intervention in the Soviet Union, about the necessity, yes, the necessity for revolution. And even that begins to be heard in the strike fields of Italy, all of which means you have a very different kind of Italy than when you read it back through the fascist victory. And what really is the mood of the Italians? What is the result of the elections of November of 1919? You have the first post-war elections in Italy on the 16th of November of 1919. And the socialists hardly prepare for it, because the Socialist Party is so sure that there's going to be a revolution imminently, it doesn't even feel the necessity of making a program to stand at the elections. When the socialists meet in Bologna before the elections in October of 1919, all they argue is the question of whether they should abstain from the elections or not. Bordiga, the left-winger, says abstention. What do we have to do with elections when revolution is imminent and inevitable? No, the majority says we will go to the elections, and when we win an overwhelming majority, we will use that parliament, after all, as a sounding board for our propaganda and our rhetoric. They offer no program, and yet at those elections, in November of 1919, the socialists sweep the elections. They sweep the elections in terms of emerging the largest party in the Italian parliament. Of 6.5 million votes cast, 2 million are cast for the socialists. Another million for the Populist Party, which also stands as a party of the left. And between the socialists and the populists, there is a majority in that parliament of 508 seats. The bourgeois parties are fractured, fragmented. The mood of Italy is a socialist, a social reformist, a change mood. A mood really that is drastically for change. So we come back to this question of the socialists. And they are in Italy what are called maximalists. In other words, they stand for the extreme position. They stand fundamentally, the great majority in the Italian Socialist Party, for a socialist revolution, for dictatorship of the proletariat, and for immediate adherence to the Third International. That is the burden of the Congress of Bologna of 1919 in October. That the reformists proved to be a tiny little wing, the Socialist Party suddenly emerged as a maximalist party. And they vote by acclamation, standing on their feet for immediate adherence to the Third International. Now, do you find something wrong with that? That if you are going into the Third International, and if you are committed to revolution, you discuss it and you debate it and you take it seriously, you don't stand on your feet and vote it by acclamation. What I am saying is that you have exalté here. You have people who talk as revolutionaries, but have no strategy, are not really serious, are really wed to that Second International principle that revolutions are inevitable, and that they come at certain moments in history, and that you need not prepare them or really do anything to create them. And so Lenin, when he hears about this vote by acclamation, writes to Serrati, the head of the Italian Socialist Party, a letter. And that letter is full of ambiguity, but you must read it very carefully, because Lenin is saying now, don't be ridiculous. And he writes that letter on the 28th of October of 1919 from Moscow. Dear comrade, the news we get from Italy is extremely scanty. It is only from the foreign non-communist press that we have learned of your party congress at Bologna and of the splendid victory of communism. I send my heartfelt greetings to you and all the Italian communists and wish you every success. The example of the Italian party will be of enormous significance to the whole world, in particular the resolution of your Congress on participating in elections to the bourgeois parliament, which is, in my opinion, perfectly correct. There is no doubt that the overt and covert opportunists who are so numerous among the parliamentarians of the Italian party will try to circumvent and nullify the Bologna resolution. The struggle against these reformist trends is by no means over, and you should not think so. But now, difficult tasks lie ahead for the Italian proletariat owing to Italy's position in the international field. Britain and France, with the cooperation of the Italian bourgeoisie, will try to provoke the Italian proletariat into a premature uprising in order the easier to crush it, but that provocation, I am sure, will fail. And what Lenin is saying is, are you prepared really to make a revolution? Will you go that step by step? Will you create that consciousness in the mass? Will you create those institutions that project consciousness and that prepare a people really to make a revolution? That it is not something push button, and that essentially is what Lenin is saying, and he is saying it to a party that in its majority had no conception of social change. With Serrati, you get really a bureaucratist. You get someone who believes that when the party pushes the button, the masses react. With Bordiga on the extreme left, you get a blanquiste who thinks that as long as you have a small group of very committed people, you can make a revolution. Yes, there is one insight into revolutionary praxis in Italy, and it is important. And it is the insight of Antonio Gramsci and of those Turin socialists who became certainly the only genuine communists in Italy. And Gramsci, of course, was worried. And Gramsci said that revolution comes only gradually, and it comes only after you have planted certain kinds of institutions. The conquest of the state by the workers will be possible only when the workers and peasants will have created a system of institutions to be substituted for institutions of the democratic parliamentary state. That there is something that goes before, there is a pre-revolutionary stage, and you cannot skip it. And what Gramsci is talking about is what he did in Turin and in the area of Piedmont. You're dealing with a remarkable man in Antonio Gramsci, who was born in 1891, of middle-class parentage, and who is of certainly intellectual origins and intellectual bent. He goes to the University of Torino and prepares in philosophy, presumably for a teaching career. Is a small and rather weazened young man, had fallen as a child and was permanently hunched over, very physically frail, and decided in 1914 not only to join the socialist movement, but to give himself to the socialist movement completely. And consequently becomes an editor, a publisher, a writer within the Italian socialist movement, and finally, by 1919, really comes into his own with a remarkable paper, Ordine Nuovo, the New Order. And Gramsci stayed with it. He stayed with Italian communism through those horrible years of Mussolini's repression. Finally arrested in 1926 when the Italian Communist Party was declared illegal, put into one prison after another, suffering failing health, never receiving medical attention, wasting away, writing furiously from prison, those manuscripts out of which we still find so much wisdom in social theory, finally dying in one of Mussolini's filthy prisons in 1937. And Gramsci, on the 1st of May of 1919, with a group of young comrades in Torino, founded a paper. And those comrades included the man who succeeded him in the Italian Communist Party, Palmiro Togliatti, who was his close friend and his close associate in these early days. And the newspaper was called Ordine Nuovo, the New Order. And it's a terribly important document and a terribly important newspaper. Because what Gramsci was about in the New Order was to address himself to the workers and to encourage them to organize workers' councils, or Italian Soviets, as he sometimes called them. Now, the whole tone of the New Order and the whole tone of Gramsci's thrust is one of a tremendous discipline, a discipline for anyone who really serves the social movement, that you really cannot be an exalté. We must be cold and lucid in every situation, he writes in the very first number, and not permit ourselves to be carried away by exaltation and by hasty solutions. And what he is doing really is criticizing the Italian Socialist Party itself, which is carried away by the resolution of joining Moscow and joining the World Revolution without turning into the conditions in Italy and without turning into the very praxis of the proletariat out of which a consciousness grows. Now, what Gramsci was most concerned about was participation. And he thought that the weakness of the whole working class movement was the fact that leaders spoke for their followers, that the workers did not adequately participate even in their union life, that in the unions always decisions were made by a few, and consequently when the mass were asked to participate, were asked at certain moments really to engage in an action, they hardly knew how to engage or what the consequences of their actions would be. Without participation, Gramsci writes, the passive majority might intervene in decisive moments in the life of the organization, bringing to this suffrage the frivolity and recklessness of those who, having been given nothing to do in day-by-day activity of the organization, do not understand the possible meaning and consequences of a decision, do not have a sense of responsibility for their acts. What Gramsci wanted to do was to universalize the constituency, to make everybody a participant, and what he conceived of was to turn a certain institution called the Factory Committee into the Workers' Council in all of the factories of Torino, in all of the factories of Piedmont and Italy. The idea of the Factory Council is a very banal idea. The Factory Committee was simply a union organization or a union institution. It was a grievance committee, as we call it, and it was elected or selected by the leadership of the union. What Gramsci said was, eliminate those factory committees, and instead have the entire constituency of a factory, all of the workers, select their workers' commissars, because the national terrain or the national territory of workers is their factory. That is their country. And it's precisely there that they are either practicing democracy or they are not. And consequently, what Gramsci said is, there is something all-encompassing about a workers' council in which those commissars are elected by all, whether they are skilled or unskilled, whether they are union members or not union members, and are subject constantly to the will of the constituency, to be recalled by those workers when they have to be recalled. The point Gramsci is making, after all, is that you can make a revolution in Italy, for example, with petty bourgeois and with peasants. But you can make socialism only with workers. Only workers have no stake whatsoever in bourgeois society. The petty bourgeoisie, the peasantry, they may think of independent land holding or independent property holding, not the workers. And consequently, the thing to do is to collectivize the workers, to make sure that they work as a collectivity in the factory and come to understand that industrial process that they will have to run after the revolution comes. You will guarantee socialism, says Gramsci, once you universalize these particular factory councils. The result is that in August of 1919, in the city of Torino, in the largest factory, Fiat Centrale, there was a factory council established. And that factory council, or workers' council, had its commissars elected by the workers. By the end of that year, less than 6 months later, there were 150,000 workers in the city of Turin in over 50 factories that had established these workers' councils. The commissars had three functions. They were to concern themselves, first of all, with the so-called revendication, with the immediate demand of the workers, improvement of their work conditions. They were to concern themselves, secondly, with preparation for the revolution. In other words, to teach the workers really how to run the factories. And third, they were to be concerned with education, with setting up technical schools inside the factories for the workers, and setting up even schools of the fine arts, schools of general culture, so that workers would know really how to function in a society totally. And consequently, you have what Gramsci thinks is so fundamentally important, the seeds of a new society in the old, the expansion of consciousness and praxis. In other words, you have, after all, a response to the potentiality and the capability of the workers themselves. They are responding to their local and immediate environment. In all of this, Gramsci came to clash with the Socialist Party of Italy. The leadership of the Socialist Party thought that the councils were escaping their direction. Gramsci said incessantly that you cannot dictate to the council. The Socialist Party does not have the involvement by any stretch of the imagination of all of the Italian working class. The only organizations that reflect the will of the workers are the councils. They are the democratic institution, and the party must follow the councils rather than the councils following the party. That was considered to be fascism, that was considered to be anarchism, all kinds of terminology of that kind, and Gramsci came to clash with the party. But in the final analysis, he was right. Because in 1920, when the chips were really down, and when it was revolution or not in Italy, neither the Socialist Party nor the General Confederation of Labor in Italy was able to cope with the revolutionary situation that had occurred. Only in Torino, and only with Gramsci, do you come close, really, to a revolutionary praxis. In the first place, there is, in 1920, no observation that the enemy is organizing. And note it well, that fascism was apparent by 1920, that the organization of the ruling class was very apparent by 1920, and all of it escaped the enthusiasm of the Italian socialists. Consider, if you please, that the Prime Minister in 1919 is Nitti, and he lasts until May of 1920. And Federico Nitti begins to increase the number of police in all of the cities, begins to increase the number of troops that are stationed in the industrial cities. Consider, if you please, that the major industrialists organize a general confederation of industry in March of 1920, which is dedicated to smashing the worker council movement and to disciplining the workers into a rationalistic system, as it is called, of factory labor. Consider, if you please, that the fascists are beginning to roam the streets. All of that is apparent by 1920, and at no point does the Socialist Party set up its defenses of that or even claim to recognize it. The Socialist Party had two potential forces in 1920. It had its victory in the election. It could have gone into the parliament, and with the Populist Party, have created the outworks of defense. In other words, have dismantled the fascist organization. It could really have come to control the street against the right-wing thrust, and it never used the parliament for that purpose or any other. But the real deficiency is its ignoring of the strike movement that was so phenomenal in that year of 1920. You come by April of that year to an immense general strike in the city of Turin. Now, a general strike in Turin is a strike among the most advanced workers in Italy, the workers in the steel and the automobile factories. And that strike began on the 12th of April of 1920, and it began over the dismissal of a Fiat worker. And consequently, it eventuated in a general strike of all of the workers of the city of Turin. And that strike from the 12th of April down to the 23rd was powerful and isolated, because the Socialist Party outside of Turin did not call a general strike, and its attitude was that strikes at that particular juncture were irrelevant. That a strike movement, after all, is irrelevant if a total revolution is going to come. And consequently, with the mythology of revolution as the guiding principle, this very powerful strike movement in Torino simply failed, was led by the board. Gramsci, very bitter at that, insisting that the Socialist Party at that point not a revolutionary party at all. The proof in August and September of 1920, with the occupation of the factories in Italy. The occupation of the factories began in the city of Milan, and began in the factory of Alfa Romeo. And in that factory, there was an occupation on the 19th of August, because the strike movement over wages had collapsed. And because the employers and the bosses were demanding not only that the workers go back to work, but that they dismantle their factory council. And consequently, the workers decided on a new tactic, something very spontaneous, going into the factories, occupying them, and running them. And the police tried to force the factory of Alfa Romeo on the 30th of August, were driven off, and that very night, occupation of factories occurred not only in Milano, but in Genoa and in Turin, until 350 factories in North Italy were occupied. And the workers actually ran those factories in the period of occupation, and elected their factory council, and demonstrated that in a revolution, after all, they would not be totally lost, but they would have competent. And while that occupation was on, the Socialist Party and the General Confederation of Labor bargained with the Prime Minister, now already Giolitti, back again in office, and Giolitti promised real increases in wages if bargaining should take place, and both the Socialists and the General Confederation of Labor in Italy accepted it. And so an agreement was made for a lira more per month, some extra holiday days, and no reprisals against the strikers, plus so-called workers' control, which turned out to be merely study committees of economic conditions, all of it wiped away within a year. You see the point. The occupation of the factories was a revolutionary move. And it was a move that should have eventuated in the demand by the Italian Socialist Party for the socialization of industry. In its failure to do so, it let pass the best and ripest opportunity in post-war Italy. And the results of that are apparent. The results of that, first of all, were a reaction on the part of a bourgeoisie that decided that the existing state could no longer protect it sufficiently, that it had permitted that occupation of the factories, it had not gone in and ousted the workers. What was needed was something more militant, and already the fusion between that capitalist group and the fascists becomes apparent. But more than that, a schism in the Italian socialist movement which was inevitable. By the time the Italian socialists met at the Congress of Livorno in January of 1921, they divided. They divided between those who really were revolutionary, Gramsci and the bourgeois wing, and the socialists stayed within their own organization. Objectively, it was correct to make that schism in 1921. If you were to have a revolutionary party, you could not have it with those old Italian socialists. But in the context of 1921, that schism was the final disaster, because there was no common working class defense against the fascist harass. fascism need never have come to Italy. It came, after all, as a result of the default of a revolutionary movement. And that revolutionary movement defaulted because it never understood what Marxism was about, which Marxism had always professed. That fundamentally, events do not just happen, but that they are made. That there is a voluntarism in history, there is a praxis that involves the constant interaction between men and environment, and that all Gramsci understood, and not his benighted colleague who led the Italian Socialist Party.